Bridger Mountains, Montana Territory, late January 1877. Well past midnight, the coldest winter in 40 years has its hands around the valley's throat, and you can hear it in the dark. Timber pops like distant gunshots as the log cabins contract. The wind comes off the high white ridges in long, low howls, knifing through the little settlement, probing for gaps. Ice fog hangs between the trees, so thick the lantern light from a dozen cabins just smears and disappears. Inside those cabins, heat is losing. Standard walls, standard wisdom. Logs notched and stacked, single thickness, chinked with moss and mud that has already cracked in the deep freeze. Every gust forces cold air through hairline gaps, across sleeping faces, under threadbare quilts. Frost creeps from the corners of window panes, then blooms across entire walls, glittering in the glow of fires that are burning down too fast. You can hear the consequences. A child's cough in the creek cabin, a baby's thin cry from the Thorpes, the muffled scrape of boots as someone hauls in another armload of wood, breath coming in gasps because the air itself feels heavy. Firewood piles that were supposed to last until March look dangerously low, each log a tiny vanishing insurance policy against the next sub-zero night. This was normal. This was frontier life. You burned through 2, sometimes 3 cords of wood a week, and still woke to ice in your water bucket and frost on your blanket. The difference between survival and catastrophe was often just one more armload of fuel and whether the wind shifted at 3 a.m. But tonight, one cabin doesn't fit the pattern. On the edge of the settlement, half buried in snowdrifts, sits a structure that looks wrong for these mountains. It is thick, squat, almost fortress-like. The roofline rides low against the sky. The walls are absurdly chunky, as if someone tried to build a frontier cabin and stopped halfway to a fort. In the blue-black dark, with snow plastered against its sides, it looks less like a home and more like a block of timber sunk into the earth. Jacob Reinhardt's place. Jacob is a quiet hunter and trapper in his late 30s, a man who spends more nights alone under the trees than most of his neighbors spend outside their cabins all winter. When he built this thing the previous year, with its double thick outline and heavy stone foundation, people watched from their own yards and shook their heads. Castle to freeze in, Samuel Creek had called it, spitting into the dust. All that timber, and he'll still be feeding that stove every hour. Double the wall, double the work, same damn cold, William Thorpe added, a man whose family had built cabins in these mountains for 2 generations. To them, Jacob's design wasn't clever. It was a joke. A waste of good logs and good time in a country where both could kill you if misused. But walk with the camera now through the ice fog, past the rattling cabins, up to Jacob's door. The wind drops the moment you step into the lee of his wall. The logs are massively wide, the cabin sitting on a deep stone base, snow banked high against the outer courses. No light leaks through the gaps because there are no gaps. The door fits into its frame like a plug. Inside, the scene does not match the night. A small, low fire rests in the stove, more coals than flame, barely licking at the last split log. The room is dim, lit by a single tallow candle and the red eye of the firebox. Yet the air is warm, not less cold. Genuinely, almost eerily comfortable. Jacob sits at a rough-hewn table in shirt sleeves, no coat, no hat, quietly mending a trap spring. His breath doesn't fog. The walls don't glitter with frost. They just sit there, solid and quiet. Compare that to his neighbors, wrapped in every blanket they own, sleeping in their boots, children pressed together like puppies to share what little heat leaks from overworked stoves. They are burning through wood at a terrifying rate just to hold the inside at the high 30s, maybe low 40s. Jacob, with a smaller fire, sits in a cabin that feels closer to a summer evening. Something is wrong with the picture. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? Why does his thick, silly wall shrug off a 22-degree night while standard cabins whistle and freeze? Before we reveal the exact technique, look again at those ridiculous walls. Behind that inner plank surface, behind the outer log face, there is something hidden, knowledge that's been buried for over a century, quietly turning this cabin into a slow, steady heat source. The neighbors think it's just overbuilt. You're about to see why what Jacob built is the difference between shivering through the night and actually sleeping. Now let's see what Jacob built inside those walls. Now pause that midnight scene in your mind. You're back in the Bridger Mountains, outside Jacob's cabin, snow piled against the logs, wind driving ice crystals sideways. The neighbors are stomping their boots, breath hanging in the air, staring at those thick double walls and muttering that it's all a joke. And here's the question that should be in your head. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about walls, heat, and winter that 2 generations of cabin builders around him had completely missed? Because the difference was not subtle. In that valley, a good cabin, single log wall, tight chinking, big iron stove roaring at dusk, would be down near freezing inside just a few hours after the fire died. We're talking 34, 36 degrees Fahrenheit by 3 in the morning. You could see your breath indoors, frost on the inside of the doorboards, kids waking up with their hair literally frozen to the blankets. This was normal. This was frontier life. Jacob's cabin broke that rule. Same mountains, same wind, same brutal winter, but when his fire went out at midnight, the cabin didn't crash toward freezing. It drifted, slowly. Evening temperatures in the high 60s, 64 to 68 to go. And by morning, it was still in the mid-50s with the stove stone cold, 20 plus degrees warmer than his neighbors' cabins, while burning roughly half the wood, 1.2 cords a week instead of nearly 3. In a place where every cord meant days of sawing and hauling through snow. That wasn't comfort. That was the difference between survival and catastrophe. And the timing could not have been more unforgiving. The winter of 1876-77 was the coldest in that region in 40 years. Lows around minus 22 degrees, wind chills biting down near minus 45 degrees. Repeated blizzards that erased trails overnight and locked wagon wheels in place for weeks. No thaw, no break. For nearly 3 months, the valley was a laboratory, and every cabin was an experiment in heat and cold. This wasn't theory. This was a months-long field test with lungs, fingers, and livestock on the line. Most men in that valley thought the problem was simple. Build thicker, burn hotter. Stack bigger logs, feed the stove more. If your cabin was cold, you must be lazy or cheap with firewood. So when Jacob built 2 log walls 18 inches apart, then buried a hidden core between them, the laughter was loud. Why waste all that effort on a wall you couldn't even see? But here's where his silly design quietly plugged into knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Long before engineers drew our value charts, Inuit hunters were cutting snow blocks into domes that stayed just below freezing inside, while the outside plunged far lower. Plains families were living in sod houses with walls of earth and grass, layered and heavy, that held heat through the night. Earth lodges along the Missouri used thick timber frames packed with dirt and brush, turning the walls themselves into slow-bleeding heat reservoirs. Different materials, same idea. Layered walls, trapped air, thermal mass. Jacob's double log wall with its dense stone core was accidentally echoing all of that, an outer wall to face the wind, an inner surface where you lived and slept. Between them, not empty space, but weight. Stone that could drink in heat all day and still bleed it back long after the last ember died. Still air in the small gaps around those stones, cutting drafts. Logs outside, blocking the worst of the radiant loss to the night sky. Before we reveal the exact technique, hold this frame in your mind. He didn't have fiberglass, spray foam, or fancy membranes. He had logs, mud, river stone, and time. And yet, He built a cabin that outperformed everything around it. So what if you could steal that same logic and apply it to a modern garage, a backyard workshop, even a suburban house wall, without buying high-tech materials at all? By the end of this video, you'll know Jacob's exact wall layout, the simple physics that made it work, and several ways you can adapt those principles today. Now, let's see what Jacob built, layer by layer, and why each piece mattered. Vi snackar bars layer by layer, and why each piece mattered. But hold on. Before we reveal the exact technique, freeze the scene for a second. It is the coldest night of that winter. Bridger Mountains, Montana Territory, 1876, midnight. The kind of cold that doesn't feel dramatic anymore. It just feels heavy. The wind has turned the valley into a low, slow roar, scraping over snowdrifts and bare log walls, looking for a crack in every cabin. Outside Jacob's door, the air is a weapon. The thermometer hanging on a crooked nail beside his window reads 22 below zero, but the wind makes it feel closer to 45 below. You can hear it in the trees. You can hear it in the neighbor's cabin too. Every gust pushing through loose chinking, rattling boards, stripping heat off bare log faces like a thief. Now imagine you and I are standing there in the snow, boots squeaking, breath hanging like smoke, one step away from Jacob's threshold. On the outside of those thick log and stone walls, the cold is absolute. On the inside, something entirely different is happening. And we have not opened that door yet. Here's where I want you to pause with me. If you're feeling that wind in your imagination right now, do me a favor. Hit like so this video reaches more people who think a warm cabin is just about more firewood. Subscribe if you want more real-world experiments from the mountains, not just lab charts. And in the comments, tell me the coldest temperature you've ever camped or lived through. What failed first, your walls, your windows, or your roof? I am genuinely curious whose winter punched hardest, because this is the moment where most cabins lose the fight. Standard single-wall cabins in that valley were bleeding heat through every surface. Thin log, direct exposure, no real buffer. The wind scrapes along the outside, drives cold straight through the wall, and the heat your fire worked so hard to make just radiates away into the dark. Jacob's cabin is different. You can feel it without even opening the door. The wind hits his outer log wall and stops. No rattling boards, no whistling through gaps. Behind that outer skin is an 18-inch cavity, then 7 feet of dense river stone and sandstone, then an inner wall. A layered system that looks wasteful from the outside, almost silly for a poor hunter in the mountains, but changes everything about how the cabin trades heat with the winter. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, without the equations, that his neighbors did not? He stumbled into 3 principles modern insulation marketing loves to bury under brand names and complexity: thermal mass that stores heat, trapped still air that resists heat, flow, and windproofing that stops the cold from ever reaching the core. Low-tech, cheap, no fiberglass bats, no spray foam, no factory labels. Now, let's see what Jacob built in a more precise way. In the next section, we're going to slice his wall open on paper. Outer logs, the air gap, the stone infill, the inner wall. We'll talk exact thicknesses in inches, how many pounds of stone per square foot, and what that translated to in real temperature numbers. Not just felt warm, but how he kept that cabin 20+ degrees warmer than his neighbors while burning half the wood. To give this a name, Jacob had accidentally built a thermal mass sandwich wall, a primitive off-grid ancestor of what high-performance builders now call double stud or mass plus insulation walls. Same physics, very different marketing. And here's the part that should make you a little uncomfortable. The core of that system is simple enough to build with logs, rock, and a handsaw. It's knowledge that's been buried for over a century, not because it stopped working, but because it doesn't sell bags of branded insulation. So stay outside that door with me for one more beat. On this side, -22, howling wind, frostbite in the neighbor's cabin. On the other side, a quiet room, stone walls quietly bleeding out stored heat. Morning temperatures that mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. In a moment, we're going to step through that door and run the numbers, the exact cross-section, the measured temperature buffer, and how close you could get to Jacob's performance with a modern garage or suburban wall. But once you see how simple it is, you might not look at a normal wall the same way again. To see why Jacob's cabin was so shocking, you first have to see what everyone else in that valley was living inside. This was normal. This was frontier life. Standard Montana cabins in 1876 used single-wall construction, logs notched and stacked, chinked with moss and mud, maybe a layer of split boards on the inside if you had time and money. One skin of wood between you and the mountains, a stone fireplace on the gable end if you were old school, or a narrow iron stove with a crooked pipe if you'd bought from a freighter. That was it. That was the wall. Samuel Creek's place looked like a dozen others. Hand-peeled lodgepole pine, saddle-notched at the corners, gaps stuffed with whatever would stay put. In October, it felt solid. In January, the truth showed up. Wind off the bridgers drove snow dust through hairline cracks so fine you couldn't see them, only sweep them. You'd wake to white flour on the floor along the base logs, tiny drifts in the corners, a faint glitter in the air when the door first opened. Inside, the senses told the story long before any thermometer did. The fire roared, but the walls glowed cold. Sit 3 feet from the stove and your shins burned while your back felt like it was leaning against a block of ice. Smoke leaked where the pipe met the roof because the draft fought the wind. On gusty nights, the cabin breathed in and out with each blast. The flame in the firebox pulsing, smoke curling into the room just enough to sting your eyes. Glass, when they had it, didn't save you. A single pane, maybe salvaged from a railroad crate, set into a rough frame. By midnight, ice formed on the inside of that glass. Not frost outside, ice inside. You could press a thumb to it and feel the print melt into a wet circle. If you've ever stood next to a freezing basement wall in winter, you know that radiant cold that pours off a surface even when the air feels warm. Now imagine your entire cabin wrapped in that feeling. Numbers make it worse. In a typical single-wall cabin, you might see 70 degrees near the stove, while it was burning hot. Maybe 75 if you fed it like a locomotive. Take 3 steps toward the outer wall, and it dropped into the high 30s. 36 to 40 degrees at head height was common. One side of your body sweating, the other braced against indoor winter. And when the fire died at midnight, inside temperatures could lose most of their warmth in 2 to 3 hours. By 2 in the morning, that 70 at the stove might be scraping 45, while the corners plunged just above freezing. So someone had to get up every night, in every cabin. William Thorpe joked that he'd never slept more than 2 hours straight between November and March since he'd married a log wall. But it wasn't really a joke. You burned through cords of wood, slept in layers, kept water buckets inside so they only skimmed with ice instead of freezing solid. You accepted that in deep winter the walls were always cold to the touch, no matter how much heat you poured into the fire. For Samuel, for Thorpe, for the other experienced settlers, this wasn't failure. This was the deal. This was how cabins were built, how winter worked, how men proved they could take it. If your wife complained about drafts, you cut more wood. If your child coughed in the morning, you pushed the bed closer to the stove. No one blamed the wall. But the real enemy wasn't just cold air sneaking in. It was a 3-headed problem almost no one in that valley had language for. Wind-driven drafts that pushed frigid air through every gap. Radiant heat loss from your skin and your fire straight into those cold log surfaces. And moisture from your breath and cooking condensing on those same surfaces, turning them into clammy heat sinks. The standard single wall approach never truly solved any of that. It fought symptoms with more wood. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors did not? Before we reveal the exact technique, you need to hold this picture in your mind. A valley full of cabins that could hit 70 degrees by the stove, yet hover just above freezing at the walls, losing their hard-won warmth in a couple of hours. In a normal winter, that was miserable. In the winter that was coming, that gap between 70 and 38 was going to be the difference between survival and catastrophe. That gap between 70 at the stove and 38 at the wall was where most men simply shrugged and threw on another log. Jacob didn't shrug. Out there under the Bridger Mountain sky, he looked at that invisible temperature drop like a battlefield. The cold wasn't just outside. In his mind, winter was an enemy that attacked through every surface of a cabin, through every log, every joint, every place your heat could leak away while you slept. Now, let's see what Jacob built. While his neighbors were stacking the usual single row of thick pine, notched and chinked in a straight, honest line, Jacob did something that made people stop and stare. He laid his first log course like everyone else, then paced out a distance, 18, 20 inches, and started a second wall, 2 parallel log walls running side by side with a clean, consistent gap between them, like a hallway you couldn't walk through. To frontier eyes, it looked wrong, wasteful, silly. Men rode past and slowed their horses. You can almost hear the muttering. Reinhardt's doing double work for the same cabin. He'll run out of timber before he gets a roof on. Building a fort out there, is he expecting the Sioux or the wind to lay siege? They weren't entirely joking. In a land where every tree you felled had to be limbed, dragged, and notched by hand, doubling your walls looked like madness. But Jacob wasn't building a showpiece. He was building a shield against the sky. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to fill that strange empty space, you need the geometry in your head. Picture the plan from above. An outer log wall, solid and weather-tight. Then an 18 to 20 inch cavity. Then an inner wall of smaller logs and stone rising on the same foundation line. From the outside, his cabin's footprint was only a little larger than his neighbor's. Step inside, though, and those walls were nearly twice as thick. A layered barrier instead of a single wooden skin. Here's the pattern interrupt. On the frontier, thicker didn't automatically mean warmer. Most men just stacked bigger logs and hoped. Jacob did something different. He created a double shell. That outer wall took the beating, the wind, the driven snow, the radiant pull of the open air. The inner wall, tucked behind that 18-inch buffer, was where he planned to store heat. Not just block the cold for an hour or two, but charge the very walls with warmth. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of American frontiersmen had ignored? That still air is an ally. That a controlled gap can be as powerful as an extra log. To his neighbors, it looked like overbuilding. To Jacob, every extra inch of wall was one more layer the winter had to fight through. And that's the line that runs through the rest of this story. Out here, the difference between crazy and genius could come down to one winter, one storm, one night, when the wind hit 40 miles an hour and the temperature plunged past 22 below. If your experiment met the cold head-on and held, you lived warmer, burned less wood, and saw your children wake up without frost on their blankets. If it failed, you quietly went back to proven tradition. Jacob was betting his entire season that this double shell, this odd, wasteful wall, would do more than just look impressive. He was betting it would turn his cabin into a quiet furnace. In the next part, we'll step inside that 18-inch gap and show you what he packed into it, knowledge that's been buried for over a century, and the reason his walls behave less like timber and more like a thermal battery. But to understand why that gap of stone turned into a quiet furnace, you have to step back inside a normal frontier cabin and watch where the heat actually runs away. Picture a single room. One iron stove glowing orange, breathing fire into the cold. Outside, a black Montana winter, sky clear, snow squeaking under boots at 20 below. Between those two worlds is a thin, leaky shell of logs. That's it. One hot box, trying to warm the universe through a wall that never stops bleeding. Heat has 3 escape routes. It conducts, it convects, it radiates. The stove doesn't care which path it takes. It just wants to flow from warm to cold, from that red-hot belly of iron out into the frozen mountains pressing on every side. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, you need to see how a normal wall loses that fight. Start with conduction. That's heat crawling through solid wood, log to log, like a slow leak through a wooden pipe. Wood has some insulating value, sure. It's better than stone for stopping heat, and much better than solid ice. But in a single-wall cabin, each log is a continuous bridge from the inside to the outside, a solid path for heat to march straight into the cold. Where the logs are narrow, the bridge is thinner, and heat crosses faster. Where 2 logs don't quite meet, where there's a knot, a crack, a check the wind has opened over time, the cold bites in like teeth. A neighbor might look at a 12-inch log wall and say proudly, "That's plenty." The physics disagrees. Every inch of continuous wood is another lane on the highway out of the cabin. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that those neighbors, born and raised in winter country, kept ignoring? Then there's convection, moving air, drafts. The enemy you feel more than you see. Wind slams into the outside of a standard cabin and forces cold air through every weakness in the chinking, up through floor gaps and around window frames that never quite seal. Warm air near the stove rises, spills across the ceiling, and gets sucked out through cracks higher up. Cold air sneaks in low to replace it. The room becomes a slow-motion washing machine of air. That's why a thermometer on the table might read 50 degrees, but your body swears it's closer to freezing. Moving air strips heat from your skin faster than still air. Your hands feel numb when a draft slides along the floorboards. Your back prickles when wind knifes through a tiny gap behind your chair. In a bad blow, a single-wall cabin can feel like camping inside a wooden flute the wind is playing. Now add the third route, radiation. This one is quieter, more deceptive. You can have air that's technically warm and still feel chilled to the bone standing near a cold log wall. Your body is a little stove. It radiates heat outward, in all directions, all the time. When you face a cold surface, that radiation pours into it. You feel yourself looking at the wall with your body heat, and the wall just drinks it. That's why people in those cabins huddled by the stove and avoided the perimeter. 2 feet from the iron, your front is roasting. Step back toward the wall, and suddenly your back is sending warmth into that cold timber, into the night. The air thermometer hasn't changed, but the radiant balance has. You are now heating the cabin instead of the cabin heating you. Put all 3 together, and the net effect is brutal. A standard single-wall cabin in a Montana blizzard is like wearing one thin, wind-leaky coat. Better than nothing, but every gust drives cold through the fabric. Every contact with a cold surface steals heat. Every stitch line leaks. You can stay alive, but only if you keep feeding the fire, hour after hour, cord after cord. Neighbors in 1876 burned mountains of wood just to hold their rooms in the high 30s and low 40s. Survival, not comfort. Jacob looked at that reality and refused to accept it as normal frontier life. He wasn't chasing a slightly better coat. He was trying to build the thermal equivalent of a stone fortress. Now, let's see what Jacob built on top of that double shell, how he used dense riverstone and sandstone to slow conduction, calm convection, and flip radiant loss in his favor. That's where the wall stops being a leak and starts becoming a battery, and where the difference between survival and catastrophe suddenly narrows to 18 inches of hidden design. Now let's see what Jacob built when he decided his walls were going to act more like a thermos than a fence. This didn't start at eye level. It started in the ground. Because if you're going to pour several tons of stone into a cabin wall, the frontier rule is simple. You either respect gravity, or gravity teaches you a lesson you don't forget. He dug first. In some spots, nearly 4 feet down, chasing firm ground, and, where he could find it, bedrock. Bridger Mountain's clay, frost-heaved and treacherous, got carved back until his shovel rang on something that wouldn't move. That trench wasn't narrow either. He widened it well past the inner and outer wall lines. Then he laid a broad stone footing, flat river rock, and broken sandstone, bedded tight. No mortar, just weight and contact. This was not a casual experiment. You don't dig that deep and stack that much stone if you think you might tear it out next year. On top of that, the outer shell rose first. Full diameter logs, heavy and green, notched in the familiar frontier pattern. But Jacob treated those joints like a gunsmith treats a lock. Tight, clean, no daylight showing. He spent extra time with the axe, tuning each saddle notch so the logs kissed along their length. The neighbors joked he was courting the timber. He just kept working. Every gap was chinked with moss, clay, and fibers, then pinned with smaller wedges. No wind paths, no little chimneys for the Montana winter to whistle through. He chose denser local timber for that outside wall, slow-grown pine and fir that had spent decades wrestling with the high country wind. Those outer logs took the weather, took the driven snow, shed the ice. Think of them as armor. They didn't have to hold the heat. They had to keep the worst of the cold from ever reaching the real engine of the cabin. Inside, 18 inches back from that first wall, Jacob raised a second shell. This one looked wrong to anyone used to a clean log interior. Smaller logs, flatter faces, and between them, courses of stacked stone climbing from the foundation up to about 7 feet. Why 7? That's roughly where a standing person's chest and shoulders throw off the most radiant heat. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed? That you don't just insulate the air, you shape where the warmth goes and where it stays. Those interior stones weren't decoration. They tied into the footing, locked against the inner logs, forming a low wall of mass that circled the cabin. Above that, lighter log work could continue, but from floor to shoulder height, you were wrapped in density. The gap between shells was not left as a cold, empty cavity. Before we reveal the exact technique, remember this. Still air is an insulator. Moving air is a thief. Jacob laid in larger stones first, bridging between the inner stone courses and the outer logs, creating a structural interlock so the whole assembly behaved like one thick wall instead of 2 flimsy ones. In between those anchors, he poured in smaller rocks, letting them tumble and nest until there were no clear tunnels for air to race through. Only then did he attack the remaining voids. Moss from the creek banks, fine dirt, sawdust from his own axe and saw work. He packed them into every pocket he could reach, tamping until the cavity held not open channels, but millions of tiny trapped air pockets. Air that couldn't move, but could cushion. Air that slowed the cold to a crawl. From that deep stone footing up through the rock and log infill to that 7-foot mark, Jacob had created a continuous thermal mass band, a heavy belt cinched around the cabin. During the day, with the fire going, that band absorbed heat slowly, its temperature rising degree by degree. At night, when lesser cabins plunged toward freezing the moment the flames died, his walls gave that heat back, bleeding it into the room over hours. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century sits right there in that belt, stone and trapped air doing a quiet deal with the fire. You burn hard now, we'll carry the warmth later. In a blizzard, that difference between survival and catastrophe can literally be the 18 inches you don't see. But a wall that acts like a thermos is only half the story. How did this strange, heavy design actually perform when the wind screamed down off the mountains and the mercury bottomed out? In the next part, we'll put numbers to it. Temperatures, firewood, and the brutal test winter that shut his neighbors up for good. But to understand why Jacob's readings looked like a misprint, you have to look inside the wall. Not at the logs, not at the fire, at the invisible thing doing most of the work, still air. Now, let's see what Jacob built in physical terms. Think about a down jacket. It's not the feathers keeping you warm. It's the millions of tiny air pockets the feathers trap, each one too small for a real breeze to form. No breeze means no convective highway for heat to escape. An igloo works the same way. Snow is just frozen water, terrible as a solid insulator. But the trapped air inside the snow crystals turns that ice cave into a surprisingly warm shelter. Jacob, without a physics textbook, recreated that principle in his cabin walls. He packed moss, dirt, and sawdust into every crack between the inner logs, the outer logs, and the stone belt. Each smear of chinking trapped air in place. Still air. Not swirling, not leaking, just sitting there like a quiet guard between warm and cold. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors missed? That you don't need fancy materials in the mountains, you need to immobilize the air you already have. Then there's the heavy part, the stone. Thermal mass sounds like a modern engineering buzzword, but you use it every time you cook. A thin steel pan flashes hot and cold in seconds. A thick cast iron skillet takes time to heat, then stays warm long after the burner is off. A masonry heater, once charged, radiates gentle heat all night while the firebox sits dark. Jacob's stone and log belt was the same idea, stretched around the entire cabin. Those 8,000 pounds of riverstone and sandstone turned his walls into a slow battery. The fire charged them through the evening. Dense material absorbed heat, its temperature climbing degree by degree, while the outer wall throttled how quickly that heat could leak to the freezing air outside. When the fire went out and his neighbors' cabins plunged toward the 30s, Jacob's stone quietly reversed roles. It became the heat source, bleeding warmth back into the room for 6, 7, 8 hours. But the double shell did something else his neighbors never saw. It tamed the wind. The outer log wall took the hit, pressure, turbulence, those brutal gusts screaming down off the ridges. Any tiny gaps out there did leak, but the leak died in the cavity. By the time air reached the inner wall, it wasn't a draft. It was a slow, filtered temperature change. No whistling between boards. No icy ribbons of air sliding across your neck while you tried to sleep. That's where radiant comfort comes in. The part most people in 1876, and plenty today, don't talk about. You can have a thermometer reading 60 Adris and still feel miserable if every surface around you is cold. Stand next to a single log wall at 20 degrees outside and you feel that cold soak in your bones. Your body is radiating heat into that chilled surface like a tiny stove losing to the night. In Jacob's cabin, the inner log faces and exposed stone warmed up and stayed closer to room temperature. So 65, 68 degrees in there felt truly warm, not marginal. You weren't fighting the walls with your own body heat. Before we reveal the exact technique you can steal from this for your own cabin, pull the pieces together. Jacob hadn't built a box with a fire, he'd built a thermos, cold outer shell taking the abuse, warm inner shell facing the room. Between them, layers of trapped air and heavy stone forcing heat to move slowly. On his terms, not the winter's. That is knowledge that's been buried for over a century. And in the next section, you'll see how that thermos wall performed when the cold tried to break it. Jacob hadn't built a box with a fire. He'd built a thermos, and on that raw edge between fall and true winter, that thermos became a spectacle. By late October, word had spread through the valley. The German hunter up by the cottonwoods was wasting a cabin on some double-wall contraption. In a place where every log meant sweat and every nail cost freight, That was nearly a moral crime. Samuel Creek was the first to really take offense. Samuel had built over 24 cabins from the Bitterroots to the Bighorns. He was the man you asked when you didn't want your roof to cave under snow. When he rode up, he didn't even dismount at first. He just squinted at the thick twin log rows and the piles of riverstone waiting to disappear between them. "Waste of good timber," he said, short, flat, final. Then he added the frontier version of a code review. "You could have built 2 proper cabins with what you've stood up here, Reinhardt. All that wall, same fire inside. You think the cold cares? Now, let's see what Jacob built from their point of view. 2 log shells, 18 inches apart, beams doubled, notched twice, foundation widened to carry nearly 4 tons of stone. To men who measured cabins in days of labor and cords of wood, it looked like double work for the same square footage. No extra beds, no extra roof, just thickness." William Thorpe, the former Army engineer, approached it like a failed fortification. He'd drawn lines for blockhouses along the Platte, calculated angles of fire, counted wagon loads of quartermaster brick. When he saw Jacob stacking stone into the cavity, he laughed loud enough for the neighbors in the next field to hear. "You building for the Sioux or the Russians," he called. "That's a fort wall for a war that doesn't exist. You'll freeze in your castle before anyone bothers to attack it." Then came the technical objections, the kind that sound smart enough to sway a whole valley. Thorpe walked the perimeter, boot tapping the foundation stones, hand pressed to the outer wall. "You trap moisture in there. It's not heat you'll be holding, it's rot. Moss, stone, timber, no air to dry. You'll have mold running between these walls in 2 winters. And that rock?" He jabbed a thumb at the pile. "It settles. It creeps. Year 2, maybe year 3, it crushes your inner wall. You'll be patching cracks while the rest of us are just feeding the stove." Thomas Brickner, the sawmill owner, didn't bother with theory. He dealt in board feet and man hours. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Jacob tamp wet moss into every gap like he was chinking a church. "All this for cabin," Brickner muttered. "Twice the logs, twice the chinking, hauling stone when you could be cutting next winter's wood. Any benefit you think you're getting, you've paid for 3 times over. You want warm? Burn more. Simple." What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? At that moment, nothing he could put into words. Jacob just listened. He didn't argue. He didn't preach about heat or thermal mass or wind. He'd pause, let their words hang in the cold air, shrug once, and go back to stacking stone, packing moss, tapping each rock until it locked against its neighbors. Once, when Samuel pushed harder, Jacob finally answered, eyes still on the wall. "Last winter," he said, "my water bucket froze beside the bed. I'd rather waste timber than freeze again like last winter." That was it. No speech. Just a quiet line drawn between comfort and catastrophe. Before we reveal the exact technique in numbers and charts, you need to feel this part. The social cold that moved in before the real winter did. Neighbors started using a new name for his place. Castle to freeze in, they called it, half joke, half curse. Children dared each other to knock on the stone house door. Men shook their heads when they passed, as if watching a wagon sink into a bog you'd warned the driver about. By the first light snows of November, white dusting the roofs and the mountains going steel blue, Jacob's cabin stood alone in more ways than one. The walls were up, thick and heavy, the stone hidden now behind peeled logs and tight chinking. From the outside, it looked overbuilt, overthought, and to some, overproud. Inside, it was still unproven. No one, not Samuel with his 20-odd cabins, not Thorpe with his army math, not Brickner with his sawmill ledgers, not even Jacob himself, knew whether this thermos would mean warm mornings or a very heavy, very cold mistake. Because the real test was coming down out of the mountains, and when that wind hit, All their theories were going to meet the numbers on a frostbitten thermometer. When the first real cold rolled down out of the Bridger Mountains, Jacob's cabin didn't look brave. It looked wrong. Standing next to the other neat single-wall boxes, his place sat low and squat, with walls so thick they seemed almost swollen, like the cabin itself had pulled a blanket around its shoulders and refused to stand up straight. Now, let's see what Jacob built. The neighbors' cabins showed clean log faces, decent chinking, big, bright windows cut wide to grab what little winter sun they could. Jacob's walls, by comparison, were absurd. Double log rows with nearly 18 inches between them, that gap packed solid with stone up to a man's shoulders. From the outside, the wall read as a deep, shadowed band, logs framing a mass you couldn't quite see but could feel in the way the building met the ground. The windows were worse. To the women used to washing dishes in front of wide glass, Jacob's openings looked like arrow slits in a frontier blockhouse. Narrow, deep set, the glass buried behind nearly 2 feet of wall. From inside, you didn't see a window so much as a tunnel of wood and stone that ended in a small, cold square of light. He paid dearly for that look. Less window area meant less daylight. Even at noon, the cabin interior sat in a kind of permanent dusk, the corners soft and dim unless the fire was roaring. The heavier walls demanded that deep stone foundation he had sunk weeks earlier while everyone else was already hanging doors and moving in. While his neighbors were smoking meat in their finished cabins, Jacob was still hauling rock from the river, timber from the ridge, shoulders burning, hands split open. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that made that trade feel worth it? On paper, it looked like madness. More labor up front, more weight, more risk if he'd miscalculated. But he was betting that mass and thickness, not prettiness, decided the difference between survival and catastrophe when the real winter arrived. Structurally, the thing was a problem child. A normal roof could sit straight on a single log wall. Jacob's could not. The rafters had to span and bite into that double crown, tied together with cross ties and angle braces, so the outward thrust of the heavy infill wouldn't slowly push the tops of the walls apart. Every extra pound of stone down low meant more stress creeping up through the logs, more chance that one bad notch or green timber would twist, sag, and telegraph a crack through the whole frame. From the inside, you felt that mass. The walls didn't ring when you knocked them. They thudded. The cabin didn't feel like a light log shell. It felt like a low fortress someone had forgotten to finish. A stone core wrapped in timber, sunk on a foundation deeper and wider than anyone thought a one-room homestead deserved. The community noticed. Kids started calling it Jacob's Fort and dared each other to run up and rap the stone band with their knuckles. Older men, the ones who had seen cabins rot from the sill up, muttered that if the cold didn't get him, the damp would. "He's built himself a root cellar with windows," one said, loud enough for Jacob to hear. Others, quieter, watched the way the roofline met those thick walls and whispered that the first real thaw would tell the truth. Would the roof sag? Would the infill settle and crack the chinking? There were, quite literally, wagers laid on whether that strange double wall would move by spring. Pattern interrupt? Imagine yourself there, not as a spectator, but as a man with frost in his beard and 3 children coughing in the night. You walk up through a cutting wind in January, snow blowing sideways. On your left, a handsome cabin with thin, bright walls, big windows glowing yellow, glass almost humming with radiant heat loss. On your right, Jacob's bunker, squat, thick-walled, only a dull, recessed glow leaking out through those narrow slits. Which door do you reach for if the temperature isn't just low, but still dropping, night after night for weeks? The pretty box that leaks heat with every gust, or the dim fortress that looks like it was built to wait out a siege? Before we reveal the exact technique that turned those heavy walls into a working thermal battery, Fix that picture in your mind. 2 cabins in the same blizzard. 2 very different bets on how you fight the cold. And one design that everyone mocked, right up until the numbers on the thermometer started to separate. The separation started quietly. Same valley. Same wind. Same week in January when the winter of 1876-77 stopped being a story and turned into a verdict. The Bridger Mountains vanished behind a moving wall of white. Snow came sideways, driven so hard it scoured bark off fence posts. Livestock froze, standing in the fields, hooves locked in ice, their bodies drifted over by morning. More than once, a traveler was found within sight of a lantern in a cabin window, stiff in the snow, 10 yards from warmth he never reached. At night, the settlement shrank to islands of light in a black and howling ocean. Little squares of orange leaking through log seams, chimneys dragging smoke flat along the roofs before the wind finally tore it away. This was normal. This was frontier winter. But inside those glowing boxes, the difference between survival and catastrophe was suddenly measurable in degrees. Samuel Creek's cabin was the standard pattern. Single log wall, chinked with moss and mud, a big iron stove in the center throwing honest heat. On the coldest nights, with the mercury flirting with -22 outside and the wind chill knifing toward -45, that stove roared. You could hear it draw from the yard. Firewood vanished into its mouth in armload after armload. Stand right next to it, and your shins burned. Take 3 steps back toward the perimeter, and the illusion collapsed. A neighbor later wrote that the thermometer hung a foot from Samuel's inner wall, never rose above 40 degrees, and oft stayed nearer 36. Frost feathered along every crack. The logs themselves radiated cold. Children slept in coats and boots, faces wrapped in scarves, breath smoking into the air and freezing on the inside of the wall. 2 of the older boys took shifts through the night, stumbling up every 90 minutes to feed the fire. Miss around, and by dawn there would be ice crusted in the water bucket and rime stiffening the edge of every blanket. Now, let's see what Jacob built, just a few dozen yards away, in what everyone had called his foolish fortress. Same storm, same outside temperature, same howling wind clawing at the eaves. But step through Jacob Reinhardt's heavy door at 8 in the evening, after the day's fire had been burning steady, and the world changed. A cheap alcohol thermometer hung 3 feet in from the inner wall, level with a man's chest. Night after night that winter, it hovered between 66 and 68 degrees, not beside the stove, not in some special corner. Right at the edge of the room, in the zone where Samuel's cabin barely scraped above freezing. Jacob sat in shirt sleeves, mending harness or reading a German prayer book, his breath only faintly visible in the lamplight. The stone-filled wall behind him didn't feel hot. It felt gently warm, like a sunlit rock at dusk. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed? He understood that if the wall stayed warm, the room stayed human. By the first week of February, that understanding showed up in the woodpiles. Samuel's carefully stacked winter supply, cut in the fall, was almost gone. The family was out in snow to their thighs, felling green timber in sleet and darkness, axes bouncing off frozen grain, while the wind stole heat from their sweat-soaked clothes. Every trip outside was a gamble with frostbite. Every extra hour on the saw meant 1 less hour of sleep. Jacob's pile told a different story. The long rank of split logs behind his cabin was only half gone. His double wall of stone and timber was doing work that Samuel had to do with his back and lungs. The thermal mass that had taken days to charge in November now paid dividends every single night, bleeding out stored warmth for 6 to 8 hours after the last coals dimmed. He still cut wood, but less often, and rarely in the worst of the storm. The lifestyle gap widened with every blizzard. In Jacob's cabin, mornings began with hands that could still feel an axe handle, joints that hadn't stiffened from sleeping in frozen boots. Colds passed quickly. No one's breath rattled in their chest. Next door, coughing fits echoed against icy logs, and a simple chill threatened to turn into something worse. Less rest, more exposure, higher risk, night after night. Before we reveal the exact technique in modern terms, pause on that contrast. Jacob's silly wall didn't just make a cabin warm, it changed his risk profile. Fewer hours spent outside cutting emergency wood in lethal wind, more continuous sleep, a body that could recover instead of slowly grinding down. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century quietly turned a crude shelter into a resilient system. So here's the question for you. If one overbuilt stone-heavy wall could tilt the odds that far in a 19th century blizzard, what could the same principle do for an off-grid cabin, a garage, or even a suburban home in a modern cold snap? In the next section, we'll pull apart Jacob's design piece by piece and show how that crazy idea maps almost perfectly onto 21st century cold climate building. So let's take that question and drag it straight out of 1876 and into your world. Jacob didn't just build a thick wall. He built a system. 2 shells, a heavy core, tiny pockets of trapped air, and a ruthless war on drafts. That's the pattern. If you remember nothing else from this mountain cabin in the Bridger Mountains, remember that. Now let's see what Jacob built, translated into plain modern moves. First principle, a double shell. He had an outer log wall taking the wind and the worst of the cold, and an inner surface facing the cabin. Between them, he created a protected zone where heat could move slowly instead of bleeding straight into a blizzard. Today, that same idea shows up in double stud walls. 1 row of studs outside, 1 inside, offset so the cold doesn't get a straight shot through the wood. Second principle, dense thermal mass at human height. Jacob didn't stack stone all the way to the rafters for decoration. He concentrated weight where your body lives, from floor to about 7 feet. That band of stone became a horizontal radiator. Modern version? A double stud wall with dense packed cellulose, yes, but paired with interior brick, stone veneer, or even earth bags along the lower wall. The insulation slows the cold. The mass smooths the temperature swings. Together, they turn a flimsy boundary into a heat reservoir. Third principle, trapped still air in small pockets. This is where most of Jacob's neighbors missed the point and laughed. Still air is one of the best insulators on Earth. Not big open cavities where air can race around and carry heat away, but small, broken up pockets. Dense packed cellulose does that perfectly. Shredded plant fiber crammed so tightly between studs that air can't convect. So do insulated concrete forms, those foam blocks you fill with concrete, where the foam traps thin layers of air and the concrete becomes the thermal spine. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that building codes now quietly admit? That walls are not just barriers. They're machines for controlling how heat moves. When you treat them that way, the cabin, the garage, even a plain suburban living room starts behaving like a well-tuned stove. So how do you copy his mindset with low-tech materials? Picture a small off-grid cabin you're throwing up on a budget. You frame a 2x4 outer wall, sheathed and sealed tight against wind. Inside that, you leave a 4 to 6 inch gap. Then you build a lighter 2x3 inner wall. From the floor up to your shoulders, you line the inside with brick or stone veneer on lath. Between the 2 walls, in that gap, you pour cheap insulation. Sawdust treated with borax, chopped straw, even dry wood shavings. The outer wall kills the wind. The insulation slows the cold. The inner stone band holds the heat deep into the night. For a garage or workshop, you don't have to rebuild everything. You can add an inner liner wall along the lower perimeter only. Frame a short wall a few inches inside the existing one. Fill that space with dense material, brick, sand-filled earth bags, even stacked pavers, and cap it with an insulated panel. Suddenly, the first 4 feet of your wall system act like Jacob's stone belt, turning a freezing metal-sided box into a place where tools and hands stay warm longer after the heater shuts off. And Jacob wasn't alone. Inuit igloos, sod houses on the plains, earth lodges dug into hillsides, every one of them uses the same quiet logic: layered walls, trapped air, and mass. Snow around a dome, sod over logs, earth against a timber frame. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century under vinyl siding and fiberglass bats. Of course, you can't just throw stone and straw at a wall and call it genius. Moisture will test every mistake you make. That means smart vapor control on the warm side in cold climates, real ventilation so humidity doesn't rot your miracle cabin, and a foundation that can carry the extra load of brick, stone, or earth. It means checking whether that cute garage slab can handle a few thousand extra pounds along the edge before you start hauling rock. But the goal is not to cosplay Jacob's exact cabin. It's to steal his mindset. To look at a wall and ask, where does the heat go? Where does the air move? Where can I put mass so the temperature changes slowly instead of violently? In a deep winter, that difference between survival and catastrophe might be hiding right there, in 6 inches of forgotten space between 2 layers of wood. So if a frontier hunter could outthink a Montana winter with logs, stone, and stubbornness, what happens when you add modern tools, better data, and a little planning? In the next section, we'll push this even further and show you how to turn sunlight, floor layout, and window placement into the same kind of quiet weapon Jacob hid in his walls. And show you how to turn sunlight, floor layout, and window placement into the same kind of quiet weapon Jacob hid in his walls. But before we walk you into modern plans and solar diagrams, step back for a second and look at the whole arc you just watched. Bridger Mountains, winter of 1876-77. A German hunter with an accent and a reputation for stubbornness drags riverstone through the snow and stacks logs twice as thick as his neighbors think reasonable. They laugh. They call it a castle to freeze in, a joke with a chimney. This was normal. This was frontier life. You did what your father did and his father before him because the cold punished experiments. Then the record winter hits. Nights drop toward 20 below. Wind screaming off the ridges drives snow sideways through every crack in every cabin wall. Single-wall homes that look tough in October can barely hold 40 degrees inside by January. Frost creeps across blankets. Children wake up coughing. Woodpiles vanish twice as fast as planned. And that silly double wall? The one with 18 inches of forgotten space, packed tight with 8,000 pounds of stone. That cabin stays warm. Evenings in the mid-60s, mornings in the 50s with the fire out. Half the wood. No frostbite. No one laughing. Now let's see what Jacob built in a different light. He didn't have equations, he didn't have spreadsheets, but he quietly embodied 3 advanced ideas that modern building science charges consulting fees to explain. First, he trapped still air. Not gusty, drafty air, but sealed pockets between log and stone where heat could linger instead of being stripped away by wind. Second, he put real thermal mass where his body felt it. Dense stone at sitting height, right behind his back, right beside his bed, turning that wall into a slow, radiant heater all night long. Third, he blocked the wind before it ever reached his living space, turning the outer log shell into a shield and the inner wall into a battery. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of frontier cabin builders had ignored? That a wall is not just a barrier, it's a heat battery. Charge it slowly, let it release slowly, and the worst cold becomes a dull, distant pressure instead of an emergency. Here's the contrarian part you cannot miss. Every step of Jacob's design looked wrong to the experts of his day. Too thick, too heavy, too much labor, wasteful, the same way a sod house once looked primitive next to a neat board cabin, or an Inuit snow shelter looked ridiculous to soldiers who later begged to get inside. Tradition hates designs that seem excessive until a real-world stress test shows up. A record winter, an energy crisis, a week-long blackout. That's when silly suddenly looks visionary. So bring this home. Picture the coldest place in your world. That one room that never quite feels warm. The garage where your tools freeze. The spare bedroom where guests sleep in socks. The hunting cabin that gulps firewood. What would a Jacob wall version of that space look like? A double wall with a tight air gap? A short interior stone half wall? Behind your stove to act as a thermal flywheel? A wind-blocking shell on the outside of an old shed with the real insulation moved closer to where you sit and sleep? Pattern interrupt. It does not have to look pretty. Jacob's didn't. It just has to obey the physics he stumbled into. Still air, heavy mass near your skin, wind stopped before it steals your heat. Before we reveal the exact technique in the next video, the layouts, the solar angles, the small changes that turn a simple cabin into a passive heater, I want you to do one thing. Scroll down and tell us which part of Jacob's approach you'd actually try first. Would you double a wall, add interior stone, build a wind shell around an old structure? Put your idea in the comments, because those experiments are how this knowledge that's been buried for over a century comes back. If this story shifted how you see a wall, hit like so more people find it. Subscribe if you want the full breakdown of forgotten cold weather tricks, from earth berms to sun-catching windows. Share this with anyone dreaming of an off-grid cabin or staring at winter heating bills they can't afford. In the next episode, we'll take Jacob's quiet insight and aim it at the sun itself, showing you how floor plans, window placement, and a few feet of overhang can mean the difference between survival and catastrophe when the grid goes dark. Until then, picture that last shot. The wind howling through the Bridger Mountains, neighbors feeding their stoves through the night, eyes burning, woodpiles shrinking, and Jacob in a cabin of logs and stone, feeding a small, steady fire, then letting the flames die while the walls keep working. No noise, no fan, just a silly wall doing the hard part of winter for him.